Those of us who are conservative lacked the courage to take on the school board, the teachers' union, the local academic elites, the news media, the entertainment culture, and we ceded ground, which has crippled this country's understanding of itself. And part of what Callista and I have done, in her case for 4 to 8-year-olds, with Ellis the Elephant, in my case, in writing novels, is to try to get across to the American people, this is a country worth knowing, and you know it by learning its history. You become an American. Any other place in the world, you can claim genetic patterns, geography. It's not true here. You can come here from Haiti, Somalia, China, Mexico. In Callista's case, her grandparents came from Switzerland and Poland. In my case, they came from places like Scotland and Ireland. You can come from anywhere. And you can learn to be an American. But to do that, you have to learn to be an American. And if you have an academic elite and a news media elite and an entertainment elite who are opposed to teaching you how to be an American, you literally cut off the lifeblood of this country. And so that's the basis of what we've been doing. And that's why we have an American Legacy Tour. Now, several people said when they found out I was coming out here, that if I'm going to come out here and talk about George Washington, which to a lot of people seems a long way off, and when talk about Sweet Land of Liberty and Land of the Pilgrim's Pride, Callista's, both of our books, by the way, have become New York Times bestsellers, and Land of the Pilgrim's Pride, which came out just recently, is actually about the 13 colonies. Her mother, who's now 80, wrote her and said, you should not say this is for 4 to 8 years old, this is for 4 to 80 years old, because nobody has studied the colonies, and therefore it's brand new information for everybody. And somebody said to me, okay, you're going to do that, but what you really should do in order to engage Washington in the national media is you should apply it to the fiscal cliff. And I thought to myself, at the Reagan Library, what better place to go back to first principles? And since I've written now 3 novels on George Washington, what better pattern than to weave these 2 giants, Ronald Reagan, after whom the Soviet Empire disappeared, and George Washington, after whom we became a country. And to ask yourselves, what are the lessons of history? I don't study history because it's an interesting habit. I study history to better understand the present and the future so that I can be engaged in making history by being an intelligent, informed person. That's what citizenship ought to be. And so what are some of the lessons? Now, let me start with the fiscal cliff. And I'll ask a simple, obvious question. This is a very sophisticated group. How many of you have heard the term fiscal cliff? Okay. Now, I want to say something which in Washington will be seen as heretical and as Gingrich once again going off and doing things that make no sense. Like the contract with America, the balanced budget, welfare reform. I participated in my career, Reagan, supply-side economics, the defeat of the Soviet Empire. I'm proud of the number of things I participated in that made no sense in Washington. There is no fiscal cliff. This is absolute, total nonsense. The best way to understand what happens to all of us is to read a great essay by Thomas Wolfe, entitled Mau-Mauing the Flag Catchers. This goes back, I think, to the 60s, when he first wrote it. Now, Wolfe is trying to describe a particular pattern in San Francisco, in which the welfare department has figured out that all of the senior welfare people should be on the 2nd floor of the welfare office, hiding from the people they serve. And the newest, least paid people should be on the ground floor, screening the people who are mad. And Wolfe describes the Samoan community in San Francisco as having figured out what the game was. And so you would have 6'5" and 6'6" Samoans come in, carrying traditional native war clubs. And they would walk up to the front desk and they would say, I want to see the boss. And the underpaid, brand new staff person would say, we're not supposed to let you see the boss. And they would start to hit the floor with their club. And so you'd have this normal-sized person staring up at this gigantic Samoan with his war club and thinking to himself, do they pay me enough for the next part of this? And if you haven't read this essay, Thomas Wolfe is one of the greatest observers of the American scene in our generation. If you've never read this, it's worth you going back and reading, because we're revisiting everything Wolfe described in his great early essays. We're revisiting, because the left has continued to mutate and evolve and metastasize and become more Baroque than it was when Wolfe first described it. And so now, instead of it being the local Samoans at the local San Francisco office, it's the national news media. And they get together and they chant fiscal cliff, fiscal cliff, fiscal cliff. And if you're an intelligent politician and you walk out to do a press conference and you say what I just said to you, which is the fiscal cliff is a fantasy. It is an excuse to panic. It's a device to get all of us running down the road so we accept whatever Obama wants, because otherwise we have failed the fiscal cliff. And how can you be a patriot if you don't do what the fiscal cliff requires? And the fiscal cliff will tell us one afternoon, much like the Land of Oz, where there will be this person hiding behind the machine who will say, raise taxes now. And if you don't raise taxes now, you have violated the fiscal cliff. Now, do any of you want to be the person who stands up and destroys America by violating the fiscal cliff? Do you want to go on one of the national networks and explain that you are so reactionary, so out of touch with life, that you don't care that America is going to die late on Thursday? I mean, it's all right if that's the kind of person you are. We just need to know it now, because we're never going to schedule you. You'll never be on television, because after all, you're clearly weird. So let me start with the fiscal cliff idea and say there is no fiscal cliff. Let me say a second about conservatives and Republicans who are demoralized. Get over it. We had a bad election. We did a number of stupid things. We faced an opponent who was smarter than we were, worked harder than we did, thought longer than we did some clever things. Ronald Reagan, one of his most important single statements is February 1975 in Washington at the Conservative Political Action Committee meeting. Now, I was part of this. I ran in '74. I've had no sense of timing. So I picked Watergate to run in. I'm in Georgia. I'm a Yankee-born Army brat with a strange accent, a weird name, running as a Republican during Watergate. This was beyond not clever. This was like, you know, don't give him money, pay for the therapy. In December of 1974, Republican Party ID was at 17%. And there was serious talk about, is the party going to disappear and be replaced? Now, it was nonsense, but it was serious talk. And I was part of the group that came out of the wreckage and began meeting with a guy named Eddie Mai at the Republican National Committee and doing serious in-depth analysis of what just went wrong. And why did it go wrong? And why was it? They actually ran a series of commercials called Republicans Are People Too. Now, when you're in bad enough trouble that you run a commercial that says, hey, I'm a person too, I mean, you know that you're deeply moving. It was in this environment that Ronald Reagan went to CPAC and said, we need bold colors, no pale pastels. And he was throwing down a battle sign. He was saying, don't tell me you've got to sell out. Don't tell me you've got to cave. Don't tell me you've got to do whatever the left wants. There are moments in history when you draw a line and you fight. Now, we have 30 governors. We have control of the United States House of Representatives. We have a huge number of state legislatures. The idea that we are supposed to create a surrender caucus in order to be socially acceptable in Washington is absurd. Now, let's be clear, that's what people are currently forming in Washington. How much do I need to surrender so you won't beat me anymore? When I was finally elected to the Congress, by the way, in terms of my bad scheduling, the second time I ran, Jimmy Carter was at the head of the Democratic ticket. And I remember it was the best campaign technically I ever ran. And it felt really good towards the end. And Elton and Pete have been through these moments when everything feels right because you're the candidate and you're in the middle of the cocoon. And so I went in to vote at the Neva Lomason Library on Election Day, 1976. And the state of Georgia was very proud that Jimmy Carter was the nominee. And I found myself standing in line behind three people who had come from the nursing home to get revenge for Sherman's march through Georgia. And I thought to myself, how likely is it that after they vote for Jimmy Carter, they will split their ticket for a Yankee-born Army brat on the Republican side? And I thought, this is going to be a long evening. And it was. I went from 48.5% against the dean of the delegation in 1974 to 48.3% in 1976, barely enough to survive. And then Carter proved that the left can't govern, and by 1978 I won the seat. When I came to Washington, the Democrats had been so dominant from 1973 on that they would saunter onto the floor of the House looking for Republicans to beat up. And Republicans would slink onto the floor of the House hoping not to be noticed. And the new generation who were elected starting in '78 literally banded together and went to the floor of the House to find Democrats to beat up. And we'd pick fights with them. I'm talking about I'm talking about debating. I'm not talking about physically. I just want to make that clear so that nobody in the national media says Gingrich advocates beating up Democrats. You have to be very careful how these things spread. But I do agree passionately with Margaret Thatcher's rule. First you win the argument, then you win the vote. And so we got groups of people who would go to the floor regularly and start debating. And after a while, the Democrats stopped coming to the floor because they understood there were more of us who were prepared to debate than there were of them. We studied it every week because we didn't have to govern. I mean, they were running the House. We were the minority, as Phil Gramm once pointed out to me when he switched sides, and he became a Republican, he said, if you're in the majority, you have to have an idea, fashion it into a bill, hold hearings, mark up the bill, pass through your body, go to conference with the Senate, get something done. You're busy all day long trying to achieve something. If you're in the minority, you get to golf and vote no. That becomes a self-perpetuating model. And one of the things I would say to the House Republicans is to get a grip. They are the majority. They're not the minority. They don't need to cave into Obama. They don't need to form a surrender caucus. The senators will do whatever senators do. The Senate, as Pete knows, is an institution in which individuality totally dominates teamwork. Each senator is a unique figure. Each senator somehow fashions out what they're going to do. You're not going to, in the short run, in the minority, organize the Senate Republicans in terms of actually being able to do something positive. You may be able to organize them to do negative things, but you're not going to get them to suddenly magically come up with a formula because there are always going to be 5 or 6 different versions depending on how many senators are in the room. On the House side, you're in a different situation. You are the majority. You control the schedule. You control the committees. You control the hearings. And so my number one bit of advice to the congressional Republicans is simple. Back out of all of this negotiating with Obama. The president is overwhelmingly dominant in the news media. You start setting up the definition of success, finding an agreement with Obama, you just gave Obama the ability to say to you, not good enough. We sent welfare reform down to Clinton 3 times, and he vetoed it the first 2 times. We didn't start by reaching an agreement. We started by doing something. If the House Republicans would say to every single subcommittee, and there are a ton of subcommittees, every one of you is going to hold hearings on waste in government. So why don't you go back home and they could create 1-800-WASTE. Okay, there are probably technically a few more letters in there, so I'll let you add whatever the number are to get to the right number for the phone company. Or to put it online, which is a better way to do it, and also have it available, in a variety of other formats, and say, look, you send us everything you think we should hold hearings on. How many Americans do you think could find 1 or 2 or 3 items of waste that they would be willing to suggest to the Congress to hold a hearing on? And so within the first 2 or 3 weeks, you'd have 5 million suggestions. And you could say, look, this is what he wants to raise taxes for. Somebody from New Jersey said to me 2 days ago, their estimate is that in the FEMA effort, the Federal Emergency Management Agency effort in New Jersey, $1 out of every 3 is waste. Now that may be a little bit high, a little bit low, but it gives you a flavor. Certainly it was true in Katrina. And so you start saying to yourself, let's have a discussion about how many billions have been thrown away on bad loans and solar power. Let's have a discussion about why we're still sending money to Egypt. Let's have a discussion about how much money is being wasted by various agencies. Let's have a discussion about whether or not we want to give EPA this money to enact a radical program. Now suddenly you're in a different conversation. But instead, the president and the news media have magically gotten the Republicans into an argument over taxes. And then, and I give Obama great credit for this, I have never seen anybody better at finding trivial distractions in order to avoid responsibility. And let me say, to give you a 2012 variation on Ronald Reagan's 1975, bold colors, no pale pastels, Obama Light is not a winning formula for the Republican Party. So let's start with how the media operates. The media operates in collaboration with the White House, first to create panic. You're going to run off the fiscal cliff unless you're totally insane and do exactly what we're told to do. And therefore, you're a bad person if you ask the question, why is there a fiscal cliff? And will America really be dramatically different on January 2nd if, in fact, we just hold our breath and see what happens? Second, you then go to distraction. The current distraction is Grover Norquist. Now, I've known Grover Norquist for a long time. I think he's a fine person. He holds no elective office. And in fact, he wasn't elected president. So here you have the President of the United States who is responsible for figuring out how to solve our problems, who has not offered a single serious cost-cutting measure. I mean, tell me what you think Barack Obama is going to go to the House and Senate Democrats and say, I need a yes vote on this cost-cutting. And instead of dealing with the fact that the President of the United States is once again totally failing to provide leadership, the President has cleverly gotten us worried about whether Grover Norquist now defines the Republican Party. Because as we all know, if we are not worthy of the news media's respect and love, we are a party that will disappear. I mean, just listen to the tone of the language when you watch Morning Joe, or you watch, even Fox and Friends are often this whole shtick. And I just want to make 2 points about the Norquist. Grover did something very important. He came up with the idea of a no tax increase pledge as a way of drawing a line in the sand. And let me be quite clear about my background. I voted against the tax increases under Reagan. I say this in the Reagan library. I voted against the tax increase of George H.W. Bush, which I think was a disaster and a fundamental mistake. And when we balanced the budget for 4 straight years, the only time in your lifetime, we did it by cutting taxes to accelerate economic growth. So I clearly represent a different view. But I have no problem if somebody wants to break their no tax pledge, if they're prepared to go home and explain it. But this idea that they're creating this posturing, several senators have said, I'm not afraid of Grover Norquist. Well, I just want to put on the record here, I've known Grover for years, I'm not afraid of Grover Norquist. They didn't give their pledge to Grover Norquist. They gave their pledge to the voters of their state. Now, there are circumstances where you raise taxes. Ronald Reagan, you have in your archives this great video. Reagan had campaigned at one point and said, my feet are in concrete. And being Reagan, he could get away with going to the press conference one morning and saying, the sound you're hearing is concrete breaking. Because as governor, he concluded in order to meet the state's requirements, he had no choice. But it never cost him very much because he was totally upfront and totally honest, and he went to the country, he went to the people of California and said, look, here's where we are. It's a bigger mess than I thought it was. I can't fix it any other way. I think we have to do this. But he did that after creating a commission which fundamentally cut costs and dramatically cut spending. I mean, nobody thought Ronald Reagan was raising taxes to create a bigger government. So they figured out if he needed it, then it must be really serious. What we have today is no innovation, no reform, no new thinking, no creativity, no hearings on waste, no hearings on better ways of doing things. You live in the age of the iPad and the iPhone and of Google and of Facebook and of Twitter, and you're faced with a federal government which currently runs at the pace of a manual typewriter. And you have no serious effort in either party to fundamentally overhaul the system. And in that sense, we're told by people who are running a disaster, we need more of your money to prop up a disaster we can't reform. And it's a bipartisan failure. Now, the last thing I want to talk about is how Washington, I think, would have dealt with this. Washington is a remarkable person. I think he is the most important single American. I think all of us stand on his shoulders. I think we probably would not have won the American Revolutionary War without him. We might well not have gotten a constitution without him. And we might well not have been able to find an orderly system of self-government. And we all stand on his shoulders. And Washington was very big on listening to people who actually knew what they were doing. And I mean this in a very specific, narrow way. Because I'm not against listening to people who know more than you do about their topic. I'm against listening to consultants who know less than you do, but get paid for telling you things so you feel secure because you paid somebody else, and if it fails, it's their fault. So Washington, for example, in a fight at Trenton, this is in the second Trenton campaign, needs advice, calls a council of war. And there are two people in the council who are not part of his military. They're local farmers. And I always remind, I was at one time the longest serving teacher in the senior military. I spent 23 years talking about the art of war. And I would always tell generals and admirals, the reason Washington had these two people in the room is they were farmers who actually knew the local neighborhood. And they were the only two people in the room who knew that there was a sunken road south of Trenton, and you could go from Trenton to Princeton, and the British Army wouldn't see you. Now, they weren't there for social reasons. They were there because they were literally the only two people who knew what they were doing. And so you have with Washington something which you see almost none of in Washington today. And that is a person who is prepared to reach out to the person who knows. I spent years, literally years, at the Center for Health Transformation, trying to convince the government, in both the Republican and Democratic Party, that we have between $70 and $110 billion a year of fraud in Medicare and Medicaid. And my sources were very straightforward: American Express, Visa, and MasterCard. If you had in the federal government in Medicare and Medicaid the same level of fraud you get at American Express, you would save somewhere between $70 and $110 billion a year without raising taxes and without punishing any honest person. Can't get anybody to listen to them. They don't fit the Congressional Budget Office model. They're not in the bureaucracy. They have these weird private sector ideas. They want to use computers. I mean, there's just a whole series of weird things about this. And that's where we are. We're a country which could solve virtually all of its problems. If you read, and I want to close with this reference back to Washington for a second. Because I'm frankly, close to having gone around the country listening to conservatives bellyache and Republicans bellyache. You know, can you imagine, I've written 3 novels in Washington. To Try Men's Souls, crossing the Delaware on Christmas night with ice in the river during a snowstorm, to march 9 miles in the dark with an army which has shrunk from 30,000 to 2,500, and of the 2,500, 1 out of every 3 do not have boots. They're wearing burlap bags on their feet and leaving a trail of blood. So when conservatives say to me, "Oh, gee, I don't know what I'll do. It's so difficult." Do you have any idea what it costs to become free? What people did, what they paid? But can you imagine if Washington brought in his consultants? "Hi, I've got this idea. We're going to cross the river at night." Can't do that. Won't work on a 30-second commercial. Our second volume is Valley Forge. And by the way, if you want to see a Congress that's truly incompetent, don't rely on the current model. They're amateurs. Go back and look at the Continental Congress. 14,000 soldiers cross a ridge into the valley that's called Valley Forge, promised by the Congress that they would have money, they would have supplies, and they'd have equipment to build cottages. They have 1 axe for 14,000 people. And we wrote Valley Forge in part to remind folks, it's always hard to be free. It's always difficult. And Washington, going through the most bitter winter in the history of the American Army, transforms the Army by bringing in Baron von Steuben to innovate and teach European military tactics, and has in von Steuben a Prussian officer who immediately understands the most important thing. Americans aren't Europeans. And I would say this to the current Congress and the current people in Washington, the current news media. We're not Spain, we're not Greece, we're not totally messed up like Europe. This is a country which, if we can just get government to quit screwing up, we would do fine over the next 20 years. But imagine the consultant report. If they came out and said, General Washington, we've evaluated the situation and you have 1 axe and 14,000 people. We think this is bad. We think you should be deeply depressed and consider quitting. A Congress that isn't doing well enough to be worthy of at least a couple hundred axes doesn't deserve your loyalty. Why don't you go home? These people wanted to be free. And they were prepared to die. When they cross the Delaware on Christmas night, in a desperate last effort before the Army ceases to exist, their slogan, their password, is victory or death. And they meant it. It wasn't victory or I'll cry for 6 weeks. It wasn't victory or I'm not going to watch Fox News for a month. It wasn't victory or I think I'll pout. These people were really passionate about the idea that freedom was the right God had given them, and they weren't going to fail God by giving it up. And finally we get to Yorktown, our last novel in Washington. It's an extraordinary gamble. The country is exhausted. Washington can't win the war by direct assault. He's sitting outside New York. The Royal Navy has so much power that he can't capture Manhattan. 1 ship of the line had more artillery firepower than the entire American Army. People forget how powerful these ships were for their time. And so he's sitting there. And at a time when there are no helicopters and no cars and no television and no computers, he gets a note from the French Army, which is sitting in Rhode Island, which says, the Admiral of the French Navy sitting in the Caribbean believes that he could come north for 6 weeks. Now, the entire opportunity was created because Washington had had the courage over a year earlier to send 1/3 of his army to the south to fight General Cornwallis and wear him out. Cornwallis won a victory at Guilford Courthouse in Greensboro, North Carolina, that cost him so much that he said to his staff, 2 more victories like this and we won't have an army left. And they were just gradually tearing up Cornwallis's army, and he retreats to Yorktown in despair, expecting the Royal Navy to save him. And Washington has gotten this note. The French march from Rhode Island over to New York. The French general says, I am under your command. They managed to mask the British in Manhattan so they don't know Washington's on the move and think he's still sitting there. They get 4 or 5 day head start. They run through Philadelphia, where Washington has to raise enough money to pay the army to get it to keep moving. That's how close this is. The only time in the entire war that Washington is described as intensely emotional is the morning he sees the French fleet, where he is described as acting as though he were crazy, dancing and yelling and screaming and tears coming down his eyes, because he's gambled everything. He had no way of knowing if they'd show up. And they were there, and the British weren't. When Cornwallis surrenders, the band plays "The World Turned Upside Down." And it was. I came to the Reagan Library tonight, a place named for a man who believed in freedom so much that the Soviet Empire disappeared. And I came to talk about the man on whose shoulders we all stand, George Washington. And I would say to each of you and to every person, every Republican in the entire country, every conservative in the entire country, find the courage to live up to the endowment your Creator has given you. You are endowed with liberty. You are endowed with the right to pursue happiness. It comes from God, and therefore you have the responsibility to respond to that endowment. Together, we can do exactly what Ronald Reagan and George Washington did. Ronald Reagan understood Margaret Thatcher's rule. First you win the argument, then you win the vote. George Washington, the night that they were marching to climb on the boats in the ice during the snowstorm, had his officers read the opening pages of Thomas Paine's latest pamphlet, which Washington had asked him to write. Paine was the great pamphleteer whose pamphlet, Common Sense, described that Declaration of Independence vividly. And now it was turning out to be really hard. July of 1776, by December, had turned into a bitter, painful, depressing, demoralizing series of defeats. And Washington got him to write a pamphlet called The Crisis, which begins, "These are the times that try men's souls." Because Washington understood, first you win the argument, then you win the war. People had to believe. So I just came here tonight to say to you, we have no reason to despair. We have no reason to back off. We have no reason to surrender. We have every reason to behave as Americans. And I look forward to questions.
So the speaker has been kind enough to give us a few minutes for some questions and answers. All I ask is that if you have one, you raise your hand. We have people in the aisles with microphones. If you could wait until we get a microphone in your hand so everyone can hear it, that would be great. So we'll start over here.
First of all, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to congratulate you and thank you for coming out and for being a man in the arena who's willing to fight the good fight. We do appreciate that. And I agree with you that we haven't lost the war, we've only lost a battle, and we have to continue to fight. Some of the things that I think we need to do and we should all think about going forward is, one, we need to make sure that the Constitution is followed, and they should be called out when they don't follow the Constitution. We can't rule by executive fiat. I also think that Callista is doing a wonderful job by starting the education in the schools, because I think that's where we need to start a long-term plan of 30 to 40 years of turning it around, because we need to educate people, not indoctrinate them. And I think we need to go after the media. And I'd like to see you come up with something along the lines of the contract with America, with maybe the contract of we the people, to define conservatism and to lay out clearly, like you did before, to the American people, and I think we can win and conquer again.
Thank you. Thank you. Those are good comments.
Over here.
Speaker Gingrich, I sincerely appreciate your intellect. I'd like to ask you a post-election question on the current immigration debate. It seems problematic that those people who are coming into the nation whose first interaction with our country are to violate our laws or at best to completely ignore them. Are we running a risk of inculcating a culture of lawlessness with this population? And I'm wondering if we need to be concerned, and I'd certainly like to have your thoughts on how we can avoid this problem and solve this issue by not only strengthening our country, but hopefully avoiding further demise.
Well, I think whatever solution we find in immigration has to include control of the border and has to include some kind of worker permit system which is actually rigorously enforced. That is, I happen to think you're going to ultimately end up with some kind of system that has people who are resident but not citizen and who have a work permit but are not on a path to citizenship, because I think that's a matter of, at some point you've got to be practical about what is doable. But I think it's very important to ensure as you build that you're actually going to enforce the law. I mean, what you have now, and I don't blame people who show up here, if we refuse to control the border and we refuse to identify who you are and we refuse to police ourselves and we refuse to do anything if we find out you're here illegally, it's a little hard for me to tell you you're stupid for taking advantage of the richest country in the world that seems to be saying to you, please come and exploit me. So I think to some extent we have to reestablish a rule of law. And the only point I tried to make during the debate, which I think had a significant impact, unfortunately, for our side, in solidifying the degree to which people adopted positions that made no sense. I made 2 points. One is, we're not going to deport grandmother. Now, some of you may disagree with that, but I will guarantee you, if you look at this country as a whole, the idea that we're going to go out and find grandmothers and deport them, the churches will protect them, their families will protect them. It ain't going to happen. Now, conservatives should not write laws that are fantasies. We have some obligation to bound conservatism in reality. And so I didn't say give them amnesty. I'm not for citizenship for people who come here illegally, but I'm for figuring out a path to residency that gets them to pay taxes, get them to be within the law, get them to be not exploited, and ends this sore. We will never appeal. I mean, when you have a candidate who basically says to an entire group of people, and remember, we lost Asians by a bigger margin than Latinos. Now, this cannot be a gift problem, as one of our leaders described it, because Asians are the hardest working, most education oriented, and by the way, economically most successful group in America. So they're not the people who are going to stand around and say, oh, please give me a gift. But when you walk into a community and say, hi, I want to talk to you about economic liberty, but first I got to kick out your grandmother. All of you who believe in families understand that's a really high barrier. I mean, it's tricky at that point to have the rest of the conversation. Because they just say, no, I'm not going to deal with you. And somebody's got to have the guts in our party and in our movement to stand up and say, I am for a conservatism that enforces the law within a framework of reality, and I'm for a conservatism which is based on facts. And I think that's going to require that we find some way to say, yeah, I'm totally for enforcing the law. But I want to start from where we are this morning or this evening. I want to then impose, and I'm prepared to be very tough about it. I'm prepared to say to employers, once there's a 24/7 instant verification model based like on your ATM card, you hire somebody who's not here legally, we're going to hammer you economically so it's irrational. But I think people will buy that. You can create a contract that works. What you can't do is continue to go down this road of trying to find a contract that's impossible and isolating yourself from the country in a way that guarantees that the left will control, because what the left wants is unlimited illegal immigration who then get to be citizens and vote. That's the fundamental difference.
Over here.
In California, it's virtually impossible due to demographics and due to skewed registration to have Republicans elected to federal offices and for the governorship. This skewed demographics is becoming more and more important every election. And how can we do something about that? in the elections in the future?
It's a great question, and it's Theodore Roosevelt in the 1880s decides he wants to get into politics. Now, Theodore Roosevelt came from a very aristocratic family, went to Harvard, was independently wealthy, and all of his social friends said to him, "What are you doing?" And Roosevelt said, "I'm going down to the German and the Irish bars." And they said, "How can you do that? I mean, there are Germans and Irishmen there." And Roosevelt said, "Political power in this city is decided in those saloons. And you can sit up here in your penthouse all you want, but I want to be in the room where the decision is made. I want to take your word demographic. I don't," and this is where I so deeply disagree with our consulting class and candidly with one of the comments of our last nominee. I don't see demographic problems. What do you think Asian Americans want? They want a good education for their kids. They're passionate about their children. They love their children. They invest heavily in their children. They invest more heavily in their children than any other ethnic group in America. What kind of future do they think they want? Just had a survey that I saw this morning came out. Guess what the #1 validation of achievement as seen by college students is today? When you say to them 25, 30 years from now, how do you know you'll be successful? You know what it is? Owning a house. Now, if you were a true left-wing collectivist who wanted to herd everybody into apartments so they could be close to the subway, so they wouldn't need a car, which is a terrible thing that gives them independence. Can you imagine how depressing it would be to know that Obama's vote base wants to own a home, have possessions, be economically independent? And I think we as a party have to sort of humble ourselves. I tell the story about Washington and those two farmers for a practical reason. We need to relax a little bit and go out and actually listen to the people of California. You think the average Latino likes the fact that LA Unified is a disaster? Do you think they like the fact that Sacramento is owned by the lobbyists? You think they're thrilled to pay higher and higher taxes for fewer and fewer jobs? Or do you think maybe they don't have any sense that they're allowed to have a conversation with us? And that maybe starts with us going and sitting down with them and saying, "So tell me about your dreams. Tell me about your hopes." I think you'd be shocked. I had a great story. I can't use the guy's name. He's a Democratic consultant. And it wouldn't be fair to him because he told me one night but he happened to be hired by the traditional party which had run Mexico since 1929. And he went down, this was just before Vicente Fox won on a reform ticket. And he went down because their candidate was in deep trouble and they wanted clever American advice. And he did a series of focus groups and he said, "You know, you have a real problem. It's called corruption." And the guys he was talking to were the guys who were corrupt. And they said to him, he said, now this is his description, not mine. He said, "You have a number of guys who are fairly overweight smoking cigars in this room. They're going, 'You don't understand us. You're clearly a gringo. People don't mind corruption in Mexico.'" And he looked at me and said, "Let me get this straight. You think the average Mexican gets up on Monday morning and goes to work thrilled at the idea that 2 of the 5 days' salary will be stolen by some fat machine politician who's totally out of touch with them?" He said they fired him later that day, and they lost the election. I think there's a message there. People don't come to America to recreate bad government. And they're watching Sacramento reinvent really bad government.
We've got time for about 2 more questions. We'll come right here.
Thank you for coming, Mr. Speaker. I really was looking forward to you debating Barack Obama. That would have been amazing. One of the things that was really noticeable and palpable in the last year of the presidential debates and the candidates was the lack of media objectivity. And as a media person, what do you suggest for this next wave of Breitbarts and television and bloggers in order to combat and basically silence this mainstream or lamestream media that we have today?
Well, and if you go back and look at the debates, I did a fair amount of policing. But my first question as Republicans look at this, and I've just started at Gingrich Productions what will be a 6-month project of reviewing and trying to learn the lessons at a much deeper level than you're going to get from the current wave of analysts. Because I think when you lose 5 out of 6 presidential elections in popular vote, remembering that Bush got a minority of the vote in 2000, and you underperform in the presidential election of 2004, the weakest incumbent re-election in American history. There's something I just wrote a newsletter which you can get at gingrichproductions.com, in which I said the R word is not Romney, it's Republican. I mean, this isn't about how did Romney lose, this is about a party that I think has failed to become a modern, effective party. Part of the answer there, I would suggest, is that the Republican National Committee worked to create a set of debates that are hosted by the Republicans. And that we tell the media, and why would you want, I mean, I participated because and we had a great time here at the Reagan Library, but the truth is, you ended up, in the Reagan Library was also one of the examples, you end up with left-wing moderators who think they're centrist because everybody they know is to their left. I mean, these are not people who think they're biased. They think that they represent the center of America because everybody they go to cocktail parties with is literally that far to the left. And so they ask questions. If you were to go back and analyze the questions, and we're putting together right now an absolutely fascinating case study, which some of you will remember, where George Stephanopoulos asked this question about the 1963 Griswold versus Connecticut Supreme Court suit involving contraception. I guarantee you, because I was there, every Republican candidate in the debate has gone, what? Now, we learned a few weeks later that George apparently had been briefed that this was the beginning of the war on women, in which we discovered that $50,000 a year law students who are unable to afford their own contraception have to have, as part of the new socialist model, free contraception, or otherwise they'll be deprived, which then became, of course, a symbol which we saw one article yesterday, the Time magazine may name her as the Person of the Year. Well, of course, because after all, she symbolized more than anyone else the total dishonesty with which they won the election. I mean, she's the perfect symbol of our incompetence. But they clearly had a strategy. And George Stephanopoulos launched the strategy. Now, why would you want to set up a debate and invite the other team in? It would be like us saying, well, we'll make a deal. If the Democrats will allow Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, and 3 comparable people to host all their debates, and yet we continue to pretend that the news media is neutral. The news media is the left. And so I think that you have to really start at a very fundamental level of rebuilding. By the way, this is a big problem in California, where you need to have a serious effort to create a conservative, internet-based political medium, because there is no effective, coherent political news coverage in California. And it makes it very hard to govern the state.
Time for the last question up here in the balcony, Mr. Speaker.
Hi.
Hi, balcony.
Hi there, how are you?
Good.
I want to start off with last Christmas was my best Christmas ever. You were 30 points ahead in the polls. I told my family no gifts, no anything. My favorite politician is ahead. So thank you for a great Christmas to start off. And then going ahead at a little more controversial here. I did vote for Romney, so let's start off with that before people start getting angry. To follow up with that, do you feel like the GOP establishment forced Romney on us? And if you did while you were campaigning, how do you feel about that? And how difficult was that, knowing that's what they were doing?
No, I don't. First of all, I don't think there is a Republican establishment. I mean, I think Governor Wilson, who's lived through all this, and Congressman Gallagher agree with me. The mythical notion that somewhere in the country there's a club where the Republican establishment gathers isn't true. Mitt Romney spent 6 years running for president. He was very good at what he was very good at, which was raising money, which is how he had earned a living. I mean, he was a finance guy. He'd spent his entire career at Bain being a finance guy. He knew lots of finance guys. They liked him. They were comfortable with him. They got together. They talked finance stuff. It all sounded good to them. They said, hey, this is our kind of guy. He's a sincere, honest guy. Frankly, he's a smart guy. Mitt Romney's not I'm not going to get sucked into some. He lost an election which I would argue any of us would have had a hard time winning because we were in an overmatch. We're like a mid-sized college team being dropped into the Super Bowl. And we don't understand this yet. The Obama people never quit. They kept offices open in 09, in 10, in 11. I think there were 53 offices in North Carolina alone. And this is why I'm doing this 6-month study at Gingrich Productions, which I've entitled Lessons to Learn. We don't have lessons learned right now. We don't know what we're talking about. When you see these guys on TV who wasted millions of dollars as consultants explaining what they now think, what you know is they don't. Because they haven't taken enough time to learn anything. I mean, this is a serious crisis of the conservative movement in the Republican Party, because if we don't figure out the new game, we're not going to be competitive for a generation or more. That's how serious it is. I mean, don't assume we're going to win in 16 because we'll nominate some clever person who has the appropriate ethnic background and articulates better than Mitt did. Mitt got about what McCain got, which was about what Dole got, which was about what Bush 1 got running for re-election. That's a fact. And unless we get our act together, and look at the California Republican Party. You think finding the right individual is going to turn around the largest state in the country? This is going to take a serious, deep, fundamental rethinking. Now, unfortunately, I've been around so long. I was there for the rebound after Goldwater, which took a total of 4 years. I was there for the rebound after Watergate, which took 6 years. I was there after George Bush lost in '92, which took 2 years. And I was there after we lost the House in '06, which took 4 years. So if you said to me, am I strategically optimistic? Sure. They've got to govern. The world's not going to be kind to Obama. They'll have plenty of mistakes. The challenge is not what they will do wrong. The challenge is whether we're prepared to slow down, think, have honest arguments, and figure out what we need to do right. If we do that, this country will be just fine. Thank you very, very much. Is that all right? Is that okay?
Yeah, good job.
Great to see you. Thank you for being here. Thank you. Hope I didn't take your name in vain too much.